Have you ever watched your own parents stand before a federal judge and swear under oath that you are a financial failure? They sobbed on the stand, claiming I was destitute and hiding assets from them. The courtroom remained silent until the judge paused, flipped a page, and looked straight at my father. He stated clearly that someone had lied to his court. In that second, their facade collapsed, not because I was poor, but because the truth finally arrived. My name is Daniela Joseph, and as I sat in the defendant's chair inside the federal courthouse, the only sound I could hear was the aggressive scratching of pens on legal pads behind me. The air in the room was stale, recycled through vents that had not been cleaned since the 1990s, and it carried the faint scent of floor wax and desperation. I was 33 years old. To the world watching from the gallery, and to the reporters hungry for a scandal involving a local family feud, I was the villain in a tragedy of my own making. I sat with my back straight. My hands were folded on the polished oak table, resting on top of a single manila folder. I wore a charcoal suit, tailored to fit perfectly but devoid of any labels or flash, no jewelry, no watch. My hair was pulled back into a severe, low bun. I looked like nothing, which was exactly what my family was trying to prove I was. Across the aisle, the performance was in full swing. My parents, curious fixtures in this drama, huddled together in the front row of the gallery directly behind their attorney. My mother, a woman who once told me that crying was a sign of weak genetics, was currently dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled tissue. My father sat with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeated fatherhood that he must have practiced in the mirror that morning. They looked small. They looked betrayed. They looked like loving parents who had given everything to an ungrateful child who had squandered their legacy. Their lawyer, a man named Sterling who wore a suit that cost more than my first car, was currently pacing the floor in front of the bench. He loved the sound of his own voice, and today, his favorite word was broke. "Your Honor," he boomed, gesturing wildly toward me without making eye contact. "The evidence will show that the defendant, Ms. Joseph, is not merely suffering a temporary setback. She is financially insolvent. She is broke. She has engaged in a systematic pattern of deception to hide her failures from the very people who supported her. She has accepted over $200,000 in personal loans from her parents over the last 5 years, claiming she was building a business, when in reality she was living off their retirement savings." I did not flinch. I did not shake my head. I stared straight ahead at the Great Seal of the United States hanging behind the judge's head. This was the narrative they had constructed. Daniela the failure, Daniela the leech. Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that was meant to convey pity. "We are not here out of malice. My clients are heartbroken. They simply want to recoup a fraction of what was taken. They want to ensure that the defendant cannot defraud anyone else. We have bank statements. We have emails. We have signed promissory notes. The defendant has zero assets. She is broke, Your Honor. Irrevocably and undeniably broke." The word hung in the air like smoke. Broke. It was a powerful label in a society that equated net worth with human worth. I could feel the eyes of the press on the back of my neck. In this town, in this part of the western United States, reputation was currency. Being a failure was worse than being a criminal. A criminal might have been ambitious. A failure was just pathetic. Judge Vance sat high on his bench, a man of 60 with a face carved from granite. He was known for his distaste for family disputes entering his federal courtroom, and his expression remained entirely neutral. He did not look at my weeping mother or my despondent father. He looked only at the paperwork. Sterling approached the bench, handing over a thick binder. "These are the records. Your Honor, Exhibit A through F clearly outlines the transfers of cash. Exhibit G contains the emails from the defendant, begging for more time, admitting her insolvency, and apologizing for her inability to hold a job." I watched the binder exchange hands. Inside that binder was a masterpiece of fiction. I had seen the copies during discovery. There were emails I had never written, sent from an address that differed from mine by a single character. There were digital signatures on promissory notes that were dated for days when I was not even in the country. It was a comprehensive, detailed assassination of my character. To an outsider, it looked airtight. It looked like the undeniable proof of a daughter spiraling into poverty and dragging her elderly parents down with her. The courtroom remained heavy with silence as Judge Vance opened the binder. The only sound was the turning of pages. Page 1, the opening statement. Page 10, the bank statements showing a balance of $0.00 in an account bearing my name. Page 20, an email where I supposedly wrote that I could not afford rent and needed $5,000 immediately. My father let out a shuddering sigh, loud enough for the judge to hear. It was a nice touch. I almost admired the commitment to the role. I kept my breathing steady. In, out, in, out. I knew the truth. But truth is a fragile thing in a courtroom until it is proven. At this moment, the truth was being buried under pounds of fabricated paper. I could feel the weight of it. I could feel the judgment of the clerk, the bailiff, and the stenographer. They saw a young woman who looked put together but was apparently rotting from the inside out. They saw a liar. Sterling walked back to his table, looking smug. He sat down and whispered something to his assistant, likely planning where they would go for lunch to celebrate their victory. He believed this was an open and shut case. Why would he not believe it? Who goes to federal court and lies about their own child being destitute? It was a lie so big, so audacious, that its very size made it believable. Judge Vance continued to read. He was a thorough man. He did not skim. He read the header of the bank statement. He read the dates. He read the transaction IDs. The minutes dragged on. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Usually, a judge would glance through, ask a preliminary question, and move on. But Vance was lingering. My mother stopped dabbing her eyes. She shifted in her seat. The lack of immediate validation was making her nervous. She was used to instant reactions, to people rushing to comfort her the moment she displayed distress. The judge's silence was not part of the script. I watched the judge's hand. He was holding a page near the back of the binder. Exhibit J. It was a tax document, or rather, a forgery of a tax document that claimed I had earned less than $12,000 in the previous fiscal year. Judge Vance paused. He did not turn the page. His hand froze in midair. Hovering over the paper, he narrowed his eyes behind his reading glasses. He leaned forward, bringing his face inches from the document. Then, he reached for a separate folder, the one my own lawyer had submitted into the record just 20 minutes prior, which was supposed to be a standard rebuttal. He opened my folder. He looked at the document inside. Then he looked back at the binder provided by my parents. He looked left. He looked right. The scratching of the reporters' pens stopped. The air in the room seemed to solidify. Everyone sensed the shift. It was the moment the roller coaster reaches the peak and hangs there for a fraction of a second before the drop. Judge Vance slowly closed the binder my parents had provided. He did not slam it. He closed it with a deliberate, gentle motion that was somehow more terrifying than a slam. He took off his glasses and placed them on the bench. He looked at Sterling. Then he looked past the lawyer, directly at my parents in the back row. My father was no longer slumping. He was sitting up, his eyes darting around. My mother had frozen, the tissue clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Mr. Sterling," Judge Vance said. His voice was quiet, but the microphone picked up every vibration, sending his words booming through the speakers. "Yes, Your Honor." Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket, sensing that something had gone wrong but unsure of what it was. Judge Vance picked up the document from my folder, a certified, watermarked record from the Internal Revenue Service. He held it up next to the document from Sterling's binder. "I am looking at 2 documents," the judge said. "One is provided by the plaintiff. One is provided by the defense. They both purport to be the tax return for Ms. Joseph for the year 2022. Sterling cleared his throat. "I am sure there is a simple explanation, Your Honor. Perhaps a clerical error." The judge cut him off with a raised hand. The document you provided lists her income as $12,000, classifying her below the poverty line. The document provided by the defense, which I have just verified against the federal database using the transaction code at the bottom, lists a gross income for that same year in the 7 figures. A gasp went through the room. It did not come from me. It came from the press gallery. Judge Vance did not stop. He looked at the bank statements in Sterling's binder. You claim the defendant is broke. You claim she has 0 assets. You have submitted bank statements from First National Bank showing a balance of 0. However, I am looking at the routing numbers on these statements. The judge paused again. This time, he looked directly at me. For the first time all morning, there was no neutrality in his eyes. There was curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of respect. Then he turned his gaze back to my parents. The heat in the room seemed to rise 10 degrees. These routing numbers do not belong to a personal checking account. Mr. Sterling, these routing numbers belong to a defunct branch that closed in 1998. My mother made a sound, a sharp, high-pitched intake of breath that sounded like a strangled bird. Judge Vance leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked loudly in the silence. Someone, the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, has made a very serious mistake in my courtroom today. He tapped the cover of the binder with his index finger. Someone has lied, and based on the federal tax records I'm holding, Ms. Joseph is not the one with the empty pockets. The judge looked at the bailiff. Seal the doors, he ordered. At that moment, I finally moved. I unclasped my hands. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was lukewarm, but it tasted like victory. My father's face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a wax figure melting under the lights. The facade of the broke, helpless daughter had just been shattered, but nobody in that room, not even the judge, knew that this was only the first crack in the dam. The flood was just beginning. As the bailiff moved to secure the courtroom doors, the heavy thud of the wood sealing us inside resonated in my chest. It was a familiar sound. It sounded exactly like the front door of my childhood home closing behind me 15 years ago. The sensation of being trapped in a room with my parents was not new. It was the defining atmosphere of my entire youth. To understand why my parents were willing to perjure themselves in federal court just to see me fail, you have to understand the house I grew up in. It was a sprawling, pristine 2-story colonial in a suburb that prided itself on manicured lawns and silent neighbors. From the outside, the Joseph residence was the epitome of the American dream. We had the freshest paint, the greenest grass, and the most expensive holiday decorations on the block. But inside, the air was always thin, as if the house itself was holding its breath, afraid that a sudden exhale might disturb the perfect placement of the throw pillows. My parents did not raise children. They curated assets. In their world, a child was a reflection of the parent's status, a walking, talking billboard for their genetic and disciplinary superiority. My older sister, Alyssa, understood the assignment perfectly. She was the golden standard against which I was constantly measured and found wanting. Alyssa had the soft voice, the pliable will, and the terrifying ability to suppress every genuine emotion until she was nothing more than a pleasant reflection of my mother's desires. She married the man they chose, bought the house they approved of, and lived the life they designed. I, on the other hand, was the error code in their programming. I was not a loud child. I did not throw tantrums or break curfew. My rebellion was far more dangerous to them because it was quiet and it was intellectual. I asked questions. I remember being 10 years old, sitting at the kitchen island while my mother arranged flowers for a dinner party. I asked her why we never invited the neighbors from down the street, the ones with the messy garden and the loud laughter. My mother did not look up from her roses as she told me that they were not our kind of people. When I asked what made someone our kind of people, she froze. She looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and genuine confusion, as if the answer should have been genetically encoded in me. She told me to stop being difficult. That was the first time I heard the label that would follow me for the rest of my life. Difficult. In the Joseph household, obedience was love, and inquiry was treason. By the time I was 12, the divide was undeniable. My father, a man who believed that financial control was the only form of leadership, began to treat me like a bad investment. If Alyssa got an A on a report card, it was because she was brilliant and a credit to the family name. If I got an A, it was because the teacher was lenient that year, or the curriculum had been watered down. I remember winning a regional science fair when I was 14. I had spent 3 months building a complex model of a sustainable water filtration system. I did it alone, researching at the library until the librarians had to chase me out at closing time, when I brought the oversized blue ribbon home, placing it on the granite countertop with a spark of pride I could not suppress. My father barely glanced at it. He asked me if I had neglected my chores to finish the project. When I told him I had done both, he simply hummed and said I was lucky the judges were looking for something simple that year. Lucky, that was their favorite word for me. My successes were accidents. My failures were prophecies. They needed me to be the failure. It was essential to their worldview. If I could succeed without following their strict, suffocating rules, then it meant their rules were not absolute. It meant their control was unnecessary. And nothing terrified Gordon and Meredith Joseph more than being unnecessary. So, they constructed a narrative where I was chaotic, unstable, and destined for ruin. They told the extended family that I was struggling emotionally, even when I was top of my class. They sighed dramatically at Thanksgiving dinners, apologizing to aunts and uncles for my sharp tongue whenever I corrected a factual error in their conversation. They were painting the portrait of the black sheep with deliberate, artistic strokes, preparing the world to pity them for the burden of raising me. I learned very quickly that words were traps. If I argued, I was disrespectful. If I cried, I was hysterical. If I stayed silent, I was sullen. So, I learned to detach. I built a wall of glass between myself and them. I watched them like a scientist observing a volatile experiment. I saw how their love was a currency, dispensed only when I bought into their reality. The breaking point was not a singular explosion, but a slow, cold realization. It happened the spring of my senior year of high school. I had been accepted into a prestigious university on the East Coast, far away from their sphere of influence. I had secured a partial scholarship, but I needed their financial information to finalize the rest of the tuition assistance. I brought the forms to my father in his study. The room smelled of old paper and expensive scotch. He looked at the papers, then at me, and slid them back across the desk without picking up a pen. He told me that he would not support a decision he did not make. He said that if I went to the local state college, lived at home, and studied the degree he selected, he would pay for everything. He would buy me a car. He would give me an allowance. I would be comfortable. I would be safe. I would be theirs. If I chose to leave, I would get nothing, not 1 cent. He leaned back in his leather chair, the same way he was sitting in the courtroom right now, and told me that I would not last a week in the real world. He told me I had no concept of money, no discipline, and no gratitude. He said I would be back on their doorstep by October, begging to be let in. I looked at him, and for the first time, I did not feel the sting of rejection. I felt the clarity of liberation. The price of their support was my soul, and that was a price I was no longer willing to pay. I left 3 months later, 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. I did not have a dramatic exit. There was no screaming match in the driveway. I packed my life into 2 suitcases and a backpack. I had saved $2,000 from secret shifts at a diner 2 towns over. Money I had hidden in a hollowed-out textbook to keep my mother from finding it. As I walked out the front door, my mother was in the hallway. She did not hug me. She did not tell me to be safe. She looked at my suitcases with a sneer of disbelief. She asked me if I really thought I could survive out there without them. She told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life, and that when I failed, I should not expect them to clean up my mess. I told her I wouldn't. I walked to the bus stop a mile away because they refused to drive me. The physical distance grew with every mile the bus traveled, but the emotional distance had already been vast enough to swallow an ocean. For the next 15 years, Our relationship consisted of a hollow performance. I called on holidays. They answered on speakerphone, their voices chilly and detached. They never asked about my work. They never asked if I was happy. They only asked if I was still struggling. When I started making money, real money, I didn't tell them. When I bought my first apartment, I didn't send photos. I knew that any sign of success would be met with skepticism or investigation. They wanted to hear that I was barely scraping by. It fed their ego. It confirmed their hypothesis. So, I let them believe it. I let them think I was a drifting, low-income freelancer living in a studio apartment. I became a ghost to them, a voice on the phone that existed only to receive their judgment. I accepted the role of the disappointment because it bought me my freedom. But I never forgot the lesson they taught me in that study. I learned that in the Joseph family, love was a transaction with hidden fees and compounding interest. I learned that they would rather see me broken and under their control than whole and out of their reach. Sitting in that courtroom, watching the color drain from my father's face as the judge questioned the routing numbers, I realized something profound. They hadn't dragged me to court just to get money. They were wealthy enough. They dragged me to court because I had stopped playing my part. I had stopped calling. I had stopped asking for advice they could withhold. I had become too independent, too silent, and too absent. This lawsuit was their final, desperate attempt to force me back into the narrative. They wanted to use the legal system to break me financially, so that the prophecy my father made when I was 18 would finally come true. They wanted me to have nowhere else to go but back to that pristine, airless house. They wanted to prove that I was a mistake. But as I looked at the back of my mother's head, watching her tremble, I knew the truth. I wasn't the mistake. I was the one variable they forgot to account for. I was the one who remembered everything. And unlike them, I didn't need to lie to survive. I had spent 15 years building a fortress of truth, brick by hard-earned brick, and they had just walked blindly into its walls. The bus ride that took me away from my childhood home ended in a city that smelled of wet asphalt and diesel, a place where the skyline was jagged and indifferent. Freedom, I quickly learned, did not taste like champagne. It tasted like cold coffee and stale bagels. It looked like the peeling paint on the ceiling of a studio apartment that I shared with 3 other people and an army of cockroaches. But for the first time in my life, the air I breathed was my own. My father had predicted I would last a week. That prediction became the fuel that burned in my chest every morning when my alarm went off at 4 o'clock. I did not have the luxury of finding myself. I had to fund myself. I took a job as a barista at a chain coffee shop downtown because they offered the earliest shifts, allowing me to finish by noon. From noon until 6 in the evening, I worked as a receptionist at a dental office, filing insurance claims and listening to people complain about root canals. From 7 until midnight, I worked freelance data entry gigs from a secondhand laptop I had bought at a pawn shop for $80. My life was a blur of 18-hour days. My hands were always dry from washing dishes or handling paper. My feet throbbed with a dull, permanent ache. There were weeks when my bank account balance hovered in the single digits. I remember standing in a grocery store aisle, calculating the price per ounce of peanut butter versus store-brand tuna, realizing that if I bought the tuna, I would not have enough fare for the bus and would have to walk 3 miles home in the rain. I walked in the rain, and I did not call home. But I was not just surviving. I was observing. I was learning. The university of the real world was brutal, but the curriculum was practical. While working at the dental office, I noticed how inefficient their billing systems were. I saw how much time the doctors wasted trying to cross-reference patient files with insurance compliance codes. It was a pattern I saw in every small business I interacted with. There was a gap between the work people wanted to do and the administrative swamp they drowned in. I started spending my Sundays, my only time off, at the public library. I did not read novels. I read textbooks on coding, database management, and corporate compliance. I taught myself Python and SQL from dog-eared pages and YouTube tutorials I watched on the library's free internet connection. I was building something. It was clumsy at first, A patchwork of scripts and macros designed to automate the boring parts of office administration. I called it Project Slate. It was my secret. It was the only thing in my life that belonged entirely to me. Then came the mistake that almost killed me. I was 20 years old. I was naive. I met a man named Marcus at a local tech meetup. He was older, charismatic, and wore suits that reminded me of the ones my father's friends wore. He told me he was an angel investor looking for raw talent. I showed him my prototype. I showed him the code that could cut insurance claim processing time by 40%. He told me it was brilliant. He told me we would be partners. He drafted a contract, full of legal jargon I pretended to understand because I did not want to look stupid. I signed it. I thought this was it. I thought I had won. 2 months later, Marcus stopped answering my calls. 1 month after that, I saw a press release for a new software suite launched by a mid-sized tech firm. It was my code. It was my interface. The only thing that was different was the logo. I went to his office. The receptionist told me he was in a meeting. I waited for 6 hours. When he finally came out, he didn't even slow down. He just smiled a tight, pitying smile and told me that ideas are worthless. Only execution matters. He told me to read the contract again. I had signed over the intellectual property rights in exchange for a partnership that was legally defined as an unpaid internship. I walked out of that building and vomited into a trash can. That night was the closest I ever came to dialing the number to my parents' house. I sat on the floor of my apartment. The lights off because I was saving electricity. I had $12 to my name. My years of work had been stolen. I was tired. I was so incredibly tired. I could hear my father's voice in the dark, telling me I was reckless, that I needed guidance, that I was destined to fail. It would be so easy to surrender. One phone call, and I could have a warm bed. I could have a hot meal. I could stop running. I picked up the phone. I dialed the area code. I dialed the prefix. Then I stopped. I realized that if I went back now, I wasn't just admitting defeat. I was admitting that their worldview was correct. I was admitting that I was incapable of navigating the world without their control. If I went back, I would never leave again. They would own me, not just financially, but spiritually. I hung up the phone. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of instant noodles. I ate them slowly, staring at the wall. The next morning, I did not go to the dental office. I quit. I kept the coffee shop job for the cash flow, but I changed my strategy entirely. I stopped looking for partners. I stopped looking for validation. I started looking for armor. I returned to the library, but this time, I did not go to the computer science section. I went to the law section. I read about contract law. I read about intellectual property. I read about liability, non-disclosure agreements, and corporate structuring. I studied the legal system with the same obsession I had applied to coding. I realized that in America, the law is a weapon, and if you do not know how to hold it, it will be used against you. I started over. I wrote new code, better code, leaner, faster, and more aggressive. I didn't try to build a massive platform this time. I built small, modular tools for specific problems. I landed my first client 4 months later. It was a small logistics trucking company that was drowning in fuel tax paperwork. I walked into the owner's office, wearing a thrift store blazer I had tailored myself. I didn't pitch him a dream. I pitched him a number. I told him I could save him $500 a week in administrative hours. If I failed, he didn't have to pay me. He gave me a chance. I worked for 72 hours straight to integrate my system with his. When it worked, when the reports generated automatically and the errors dropped to 0. He wrote me a check for $2,000. I held that check in my hands, and my fingers trembled. It was not a gift. It was not an allowance. It was a trade. Value for value. It was the first honest money I had ever seen. That check was the seed. I reinvested every penny. I registered my own limited liability company. I named it something dull and forgettable, something that would never attract attention. I learned to hide my name behind registered agents and holding companies. I learned that true power is not about being seen. It is about being effective. I took on another client, then another. I raised my rates. I stopped charging by the hour and started charging by the value I provided. I hired a lawyer, a real one, to review my contracts. But I read every single line myself before signing. I learned to spot a loophole from a mile away. I learned to recognize the specific cadence of a lie. By the time I was 26, I was no longer working at the coffee shop. I was running a boutique consultancy firm that specialized in forensic data analysis and automated compliance for high-risk industries. I was the person companies called when their numbers didn't add up. I was making more in a month than my father made in a quarter. But I stayed in the shadows. I drove a reliable, used sedan. I rented a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. I wore simple clothes. I did not have social media. I did not give interviews. My family knew none of this. To them, the silence on the other end of the line was the silence of shame. When they called to ask if I had found a husband or a real job yet, I gave vague, non-committal answers. I told them I was getting by. I let them imagine I was a clerk or a secretary. I let them send me birthday cards with $50 checks, which I never cashed. I stored those checks in a box. They were souvenirs of their underestimation. I was building an empire of competence, surrounded by a moat of legal iron. I had learned the hard way that the world is full of people like Marcus, and people like my parents, people who see vulnerability as an invitation to exploit, so I removed the vulnerability. I became untouchable. Every contract I signed, every asset I acquired, every dollar I invested was structured to be invisible to the naked eye but legally impenetrable. I wasn't just rich, I was fortified. And as I sat in that courtroom years later, watching the judge hold up the tax return that revealed the 7-figure income I had generated from nothing but grit and code, I thought back to that night on the floor with the instant noodles. I thought about the phone call I didn't make. My parents were crying in the courtroom because they thought they had lost a daughter. They didn't realize that they had lost her the moment she decided that eating ramen in the dark was better than eating steak at their table. They were crying because they were finally seeing the woman who had walked through the fire they lit and came out made of steel. They thought I was broke because they couldn't imagine a version of success that didn't require their permission. But the numbers on the judge's desk didn't lie. I had built this life with my own hands, and there was not a single fingerprint of theirs on any of it. Anonymity is a luxury that you have to purchase every single day, but fame is a thief that breaks in when you leave a window unlocked. For 7 years, I had successfully purchased my anonymity. I hid behind holding companies, non-disclosure agreements, and a generic professional title that sounded boring enough to repel questions at cocktail parties. But the business world is small, and success has a distinct scent that eventually attracts the sharks. My cover was blown by a 30-page quarterly report in a regional business journal. It was not even a mainstream publication. It was a dense, glossy magazine read mostly by venture capitalists and corporate headhunters. They were running a feature on the invisible architects of the West, profiling 5 consultants who were reshaping corporate compliance. I had declined the interview 3 times, but the journalist was tenacious. And my publicist, a necessary evil I had hired the year prior, convinced me that refusing to comment would look more suspicious than controlling the narrative. So, I gave them a sterilized version of my story. I omitted my family. I omitted the struggle. I focused on the data. I thought I was safe. I assumed my parents did not read anything that did not have a coupon attached to it or a sensationalist headline about local crime. I was wrong. The magazine hit the stands on a Tuesday. On Thursday morning, my phone rang. The screen displayed a name I had not seen in 3 years. Mother. I stared at the device as it vibrated against the mahogany surface of my desk. My office was on the 22nd floor, overlooking the city. It was a fortress of glass and steel, a place where emotions were usually filtered through spreadsheets. But that buzzing phone brought the stale air of my childhood bedroom rushing back in. I answered. I did not say hello. I just pressed the green button and held the phone to my ear, waiting. Daniela? The voice was unrecognizable. It was not the sharp, dismissive tone that usually accompanied her commands. It was high, breathless, and saturated with a sweetness that made my teeth ache. It was the voice she reserved for the neighbors she wanted to impress, or the bank tellers she needed a favor from. "Yes, Mother," I said. My voice was steady, a flat line. "Oh, thank God. We have been trying to reach you. We were so worried. We saw the article, Daniela. We saw the picture. Gordon. Come here. It is her. It is really her." I heard shuffling in the background, the familiar sound of my father grunting. "We are just so proud," she continued, the lie sliding off her tongue like oil. "We always knew you were special. We always told everyone that our Daniela was going to do big things. Did you know that? We were just telling Aunt Carol the other day how you were always the smart one." I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. The revisionist history was starting already. 2 minutes into the call, and they were already rewriting the past 15 years. They were erasing the mockery, the doubt, the eviction from the family structure. Suddenly, I was not the black sheep. I was the golden goose. "I am busy, Mother," I said. "Why are you calling?" "Can't parents call to congratulate their daughter?" she asked, sounding genuinely hurt. "We miss you. It has been too long. Your father and I were thinking we should get dinner, catch up, put all that silly distance behind us. We are getting older. You know, life is too short." It was a masterclass in manipulation. She played the age card. She played the family card. She played the guilt card. If I had been 22, I might have fallen for it. I might have thought they had changed. But I was 33, and I knew that people like my parents did not change. They only rebranded. However, I agreed. I agreed because I needed to see the enemy up close. I needed to know what they wanted before they made their move. In business, you never decline a meeting with a hostile takeover team. You take the meeting to assess their leverage. We met at a steakhouse halfway between my office and their suburb. It was the kind of place with dark wood paneling and waiters who scraped crumbs off the table with a silver blade. When I walked in, they were already seated. They looked older. My father's hair was thinner, and my mother's face was tighter. Likely the result of surgical intervention rather than stress. They stood up when they saw me. My mother actually hugged me. Her body felt stiff, and she smelled of lavender and deception. "You look expensive," my sister Alyssa said. I had not expected Alyssa to be there. She was sitting on the other side of the booth, looking tired. She had married the man they chose, and from the bags under her eyes, the return on that investment was poor. "Hello, Alyssa," I said, taking my seat. The dinner was a surreal piece of theater. My father ordered the most expensive bottle of wine on the list without looking at the price. He swirled the glass, talking loudly about the economy, about market forces, trying to sound like he belonged in my world. He asked me vague questions about my company. "So it is computers?" he asked. "You fix computers?" "I analyze financial risk," I said, cutting my steak. "I help companies avoid being sued or losing money." Right, risk," he nodded sagely, as if he knew that. "We took a risk on you, didn't we? Letting you go out there on your own. It was tough love. But look at you now. It worked. We knew you needed that push." I stopped chewing. The audacity was breathtaking. They were framing my abandonment as a strategic parenting decision. They were claiming credit for my survival. "Is that how you remember it?" I asked quietly. My mother laughed, a nervous, tinkling sound. "Oh, stop it. Daniela, do not be dramatic. We did what was best, and clearly, it paid off. The magazine said your firm is worth—" What was it? It did not say a number, but it said, significant. There it was, the pivot. We had moved from the appetizer of affection to the main course of inquiry. I placed my fork down. "What do you want?" The table went silent. Alyssa looked down at her plate. My father cleared his throat. "We do not want anything. Daniela," he said, his voice taking on a darker, more serious tone. "We are family, but, since you brought it up, things have been tight. The market hasn't been kind to our retirement funds. And your sister, well, her husband has had some bad luck." He took a sip of wine. We were thinking, he continued, that since you are doing so well, and since we supported you for 18 years, clothed you, fed you, put a roof over your head, it would be only fair if you helped stabilize the ship. We are a team, right? When one player scores, the whole team wins. I looked at them. I looked at the parents who had told me I wouldn't last a week. I looked at the sister who had watched me pack my bags and said nothing. They didn't see a daughter. They saw a line of credit. They saw an ATM that they believed they had built. You want money, I stated. We want what is fair, my mother corrected sharply. We raised you. We sacrificed for you. You owe us. Daniela, it is the natural order of things. Children take care of their parents. I took a sip of water. I let the silence stretch until it became physically uncomfortable. I owe you nothing, I said. My father's face turned a shade of red that matched the wine. Excuse me? I owe you for 18 years of basic legal guardianship, which you provided with the bare minimum of emotional effort, I said, keeping my voice low and controlled. I paid for my own college. I paid for my own apartment. I paid for my own mistakes. When I left, you told me I was dead to you until I came back crawling. Well, I am not crawling, and I am not paying. Daniela, my mother hissed, looking around to see if other diners were watching. You have millions. We know you do. You would let your own family suffer while you sit in a glass tower? You are selfish. You have always been selfish. I am not selfish. I said, I am a bad investment. Remember? That is what you called me. You divested from me 15 years ago. You sold your shares. You don't get to claim a dividend now just because the stock price went up. My father slammed his hand on the table. The silverware rattled. You ungrateful little brat, he snarled. The mask of the proud father was gone, replaced by the tyrant I remembered from my youth. You think you are better than us? You think you are untouchable? We made you, and we can break you. I signaled the waiter. Check, please, I said. I stood up. I placed $300 in cash on the table, enough to cover my portion and a generous tip for the waiter who had to witness this. I am not that little girl in the kitchen anymore. Dad, I said, looking down at him, you can't ground me, you can't cut off my allowance, and you certainly can't break me. I suggest you enjoy the wine. You ordered it. You pay for it. I turned and walked out of the restaurant. I did not look back. But as I waited for the valet to bring my car, my phone buzzed again. It was a text message from my father. You have 1 week to make this right, or everyone will know exactly what kind of person you really are. I deleted the message. I got into my car and drove back to the city. I knew it wasn't over. I knew my refusal had triggered something ugly. They had moved from extraction mode to destruction mode. The next day, the calls stopped. The text messages stopped. The silence returned. But it was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of an army regrouping. I monitored my accounts. I checked my credit reports. I alerted my security team. 2 weeks later, the first letter arrived at my office. It was not from my parents. It was from a law firm I had never heard of. It was a formal notice of intent to sue for breach of verbal contract and misappropriation of familial assets. They claimed that my business was built on a loan they had given me 10 years ago, a loan that never existed. They claimed I had promised them a 50% stake in my future earnings in exchange for this imaginary capital. I read the letter and laughed. It was absurd. It was fiction. But then came the second letter. This one had attachments. It had proof. There were copies of promissory notes with my signature on them. There were emails sent from an account that looked like mine, detailing payment plans. I stopped laughing. I realized then that they weren't just angry, they were desperate. And desperate people are capable of anything. They weren't just going to sue me, they were going to frame me. They were going to construct a reality where I was a fraud, and they were the victims, and they were going to sell that reality to a court of law. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. Prepare for war, I said. My family is coming for the kill. The process server was a man who looked like he had spent his entire life waiting in line at the Department of Motor Vehicles. He wore a beige windbreaker and a bored expression. Standing in the marble lobby of my office building, my security team had stopped him at the turnstiles, but he had waved the paperwork like a flag of truce that was actually a declaration of war. When I came down to meet him, he did not apologize. He simply asked for my name, verified my identity with a glance at a photo on his clipboard, and shoved a thick, terrifyingly heavy envelope into my hands. "You have been served," he said, turning on his heel and walking out the revolving doors before I could even inhale. I took the elevator back up to the 22nd floor. The envelope felt radioactive in my hands. I did not open it until I was behind the locked door of my office. Inside, the legal jargon was dense, but the message was simple. Gordon and Meredith Joseph versus Daniela Joseph. They were suing me for $5 million. The complaint alleged that my entire business, my entire livelihood, was funded by a series of off-the-books loans provided by my parents between the years 2012 and 2015. They claimed that I had entered into a verbal and written agreement to repay these loans with interest, plus a percentage of equity in any venture I created. They were not just asking for money, they were asking for a forensic audit of my company, a freeze on my personal assets, and punitive damages for emotional distress. It was a shakedown, but as I read through the attached exhibits, my blood ran cold. This was not the clumsy, emotional blackmail I had witnessed at the steakhouse. This was a sniper shot. I called my lawyer, Bennett. He was a man who cost $600 an hour and was worth every penny. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was sitting in his conference room, the documents spread out on a glass table. Bennett was silent as he read. He was a man of few words, preferring to let the evidence speak. But today, even he looked disturbed. "Daniela," he said, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "Tell me about this promissory note." I looked at the document. It was dated June 4th, 2013. I remembered that month. It was one of the hardest months of my life. I had been eating rice and beans and sleeping on a mattress I found on the curb. The document was a loan agreement for $50,000. It outlined a transfer of cash from my father's account to mine. At the bottom of the page was a signature. It was my signature. I stared at it, the room spinning slightly. It was not just a close approximation, it was perfect. The loop of the capital D was sharp and angular, exactly how I wrote it when I was stressed. The tail of the letter A trailed off with a slight upward flick, a habit I had developed in college. If you had put a gun to my head and asked me if I signed that paper, my eyes would have told me yes, even though my memory screamed no. "I did not sign this," I whispered. "Bennett, I have never seen this amount of money in my life until 3 years ago." Bennett nodded, but his expression remained grim. "Look at Exhibit C." Exhibit C was a printout of an email chain. The subject line read, "I am so sorry, I will pay you back." The sender was Daniela, Joseph89@gmail.com. That was my old email address, the one I had deleted 7 years ago when I rebranded myself. I read the text of the email. "Mom, Dad, please do not be angry. I know I promised the business would be profitable by now. I know I lost the money you gave me for the server upgrades. Please, just give me another $10,000. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you half the company. Just do not let me starve." I felt bile rise in my throat. The date on the email was accurate to a time when I had indeed been struggling. The tone was pathetic, desperate, and pleading, exactly the kind of tone my parents wanted to believe I used. But the content was a lie. I had never asked for money for server upgrades. I had built my servers from scrap parts I bought at liquidation sales. "This is fake," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. "This whole thing is a fabrication." Bennett took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I believe you, Daniela, but you need to understand how this looks to a jury. These documents are incredibly high quality. The metadata on the emails, which they have conveniently provided in a supplemental file, appears to check out at first glance. The signatures show pressure variance consistent with a ballpoint pen. This is not a copy-paste job. This is forensic-level forgery." He looked me in the eye. "Who did you offend? Daniela?" "Because your parents," and no offense intended, do not strike me as the type of people who know how to spoof email metadata or forge biometric signature pressure. He was right. My father typed with 2 fingers and thought the cloud was a literal weather phenomenon. My mother could barely operate the remote control for the television. They were petty, vindictive people, but they were not sophisticated criminals. They were blunt instruments. This lawsuit was a scalpel. Someone help them. I realized. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The cars looked like toys. The people were invisible specks. Somewhere out there, someone had taken the raw, painful facts of my history, my poverty, my struggle, my silence, and weaponized them. They had filled in the gaps of my silence with their own narrative. "They know too much," I said, turning back to Bennett. "Look at the dates. The date on that promissory note? June 4th. That was the day I was fired from the dental office. How would they know that specific date? I never told them." Bennett began taking notes. "Go on." "The email about the server upgrades," I continued, pacing the room. "I did have a server crash that week. It wiped out 2 weeks of work, but I didn't tell my parents. I told—" My voice trailed off. I tried to remember who I had spoken to in those dark days. I had been so isolated. I had no friends, only clients and— Marcus. The name hit me like a physical blow. The man who had stolen my first code. The man who had taught me that contracts were traps. But that was over a decade ago. Why would he be involved with my parents? It didn't make sense, unless it wasn't a person from my past, but a professional hired in the present, a private investigator, a corporate fix-it man. "Bennett," I said, my voice hardening. "This isn't a lawsuit. It's a heist. They are using the legal system to steal the company because they think I will settle to avoid the embarrassment. They think I will pay them $5 million just to keep these emails out of the public record." "It is a classic leverage play," Bennett agreed, "and usually, it works. If we go to trial, these documents become public. Your clients will see them. They will see an email where you admit to losing money and being unstable. Even if we win, the reputational damage could be catastrophic. They are betting on you cutting a check to save your image." I looked at the forged signature again. I looked at the pathetic, pleading words attributed to me. I thought about my father's text message. "You have 1 week." If I paid them, they would never stop. They would come back next year, and the year after that. They would bleed me dry until I was exactly what they said I was. Broke. "I am not settling," I said. Bennett sighed. "Daniela, the risk." "I do not care about the risk," I interrupted. "I care about the truth. If they want to play forensic games, let us play. I want you to hire the best document examiner in the country. I want to know what kind of ink was used on that note. I want to know the IP address where that email originated, and I want to know who is funding their legal team." I pointed at the cover letter. "Sterling and Associates. That is a high-end firm. My parents cannot afford them. Their retainer alone is $50,000. Who is paying Sterling?" Bennett made a note. "We can try to find out during discovery, but attorney-client privilege is a high wall to climb." "Climb it," I ordered, "or blow it up. I don't care." I sat back down, the shock fading, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. For years, I had played defense. I had hidden. I had dodged. I had built walls. But walls do not work when the enemy is already inside the gate. They had made one critical error. They had made the lie too detailed. They had added too much texture. And in my line of work, I knew that the more data points you have, the more likely you are to find an anomaly. "Bennett," I said, picking up the fake email again, "look at the syntax." "What about it?" "I never use the Oxford comma," I said. "Not in emails, not in texts. I only use it in formal contracts." I pointed to the sentence, "I need money for rent, food, and servers." There was a comma before the "and." It was a tiny thing, a speck of dust, but to me, it was a lighthouse. "Whoever wrote this is grammatically perfect," I said. "My parents are not, and I am sloppy in personal correspondence. This was written by someone who writes legal briefs for a living. Bennett smiled, a slow, predatory smile. You think the lawyer wrote the evidence? I think my parents told a story to a lawyer who was greedy enough to manufacture the proof. I said, or they found a backer who wants my technology and is using my family as the face of the attack. I stood up and gathered my things. Do not file a motion to dismiss, Bennett. He looked surprised. No? No, I said, walking to the door. Answer the complaint, deny everything, and then file a countersuit for fraud, defamation, and conspiracy. We are not going to make this go away. We are going to drag them into the light. I walked out of the office and into the elevator. As I descended, I pulled out my phone and dialed my chief technical officer. Pull the server logs from 2012, I said. But those are on cold storage, he replied. Confused. That is ancient history. Why do you need them? Because, I said, watching the numbers on the elevator display count down, I am going to prove that ghosts do not send emails. I stepped out into the lobby. The world looked different now. It was no longer a place where I just existed. It was a battlefield. My parents had brought a knife to a gunfight. Thinking I was still the unarmed girl who left home with a backpack, they were about to find out that I had spent the last 15 years building a tank. The morning session of the trial was a masterclass in character assassination. If I had not been the person sitting at the defense table, I might have been moved by the tragic story of the Joseph family. My mother, Meredith, was on the witness stand. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan that made her look frail, a deliberate costume choice that contrasted sharply with the iron-willed matriarch I knew. Sterling, their attorney, guided her through her testimony with the gentle hand of a therapist. Mrs. Joseph, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic register. Can you tell the court about the winter of 2014? Meredith took a shaky breath. She reached for the glass of water on the ledge of the witness box, her hand trembling just enough to catch the light. It was a hard winter, she began, her voice cracking. We had just refinanced the house to help Daniela with her startup costs. She called us late one night. It was 2 days before Christmas. She was crying. She said she had no heat in her apartment. She said she was hungry. A murmur went through the gallery. The reporters scribbled furiously. And what did you do? Sterling asked. We wired her $3,000, Meredith said, wiping a tear from her cheek. We took it from our emergency medical fund. My husband needed dental work, but we put it off. We could not bear the thought of our daughter freezing. We sent the money, and she promised. She swore on her grandmother's grave that she would pay us back as soon as her business took off. She looked directly at me then. It was a look of such profound sorrow that for a split second, I questioned my own memory, but then I remembered the winter of 2014. I had indeed been cold, but I had not called them. I had spent that Christmas alone, eating a sandwich from a gas station, wearing 3 layers of sweaters because I refused to ask anyone for help. The phone call was a fiction. The wire transfer was a phantom. And has she paid you back? Sterling asked, turning to face the jury box, though there was no jury, only the judge. Not a cent, Meredith whispered. She stopped taking our calls. She cut us out. And then we saw the magazine articles. We saw the fancy cars. It broke my heart, not the money, but the betrayal. To use your parents like a stepping stone and then wipe your feet on them. Sterling let the silence hang in the air. It was heavy and suffocating. I could feel the eyes of the room on me. To them, I was the cold-hearted corporate climber who had cannibalized her own parents to reach the summit. Thank you, Mrs. Joseph, Sterling said. No further questions. Judge Vance looked over at our table. Mr. Bennett, do you wish to cross-examine? Bennett stood up slowly. He did not look angry. He did not look aggressive. He looked like a man who was trying to solve a crossword puzzle and had just found the final clue. He picked up a single piece of paper from our stack of evidence. Ms. Joseph, Bennett said, his voice polite. You stated that you wired $3,000 on the 23rd of December, 2014. Is that correct? Yes, Meredith said, lifting her chin slightly. I remember it vividly. And this transfer was made from your joint checking account at First National Bank? Bennett asked, glancing at the document in his hand. Yes, she said. Bennett walked toward the bench. Your Honor, I would like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit D4 in the plaintiff's binder. This is the bank statement provided by the Joseph family, showing the outgoing wire transfer. Judge Vance opened his binder. I have it. Bennett then held up another document. And now, Your Honor, I would like to submit into evidence a certified letter from the Regulatory Compliance Division of First National Bank, dated 3 days ago. Sterling stood up halfway. Objection. Relevance? Go on. Mr. Bennett, the judge said, waving Sterling down. Bennett placed the letter on the judge's desk. This letter confirms that the routing number listed on the plaintiff's bank statement, the account from which this alleged Christmas rescue money was sent, was part of a block of numbers assigned to a branch in Topeka, Kansas. Meredith frowned. So? We might have opened the account online. Bennett turned to her. The letter further states that this specific branch was closed and all accounts were liquidated or transferred in 1999, 15 years before you claim to have sent this wire transfer. The room went quiet. Not the respectful silence of a courtroom drama, but the confused, static silence of a glitch in reality. Meredith blinked. That must be a mistake. The bank made a mistake. Judge Vance looked at the letter. He looked at the bank statement. He adjusted his glasses. Mr. Sterling, the judge said, his voice flat. This routing number is inactive. How do you explain a wire transfer originating from a ghost branch? Sterling tugged at his collar. Your Honor, my clients are elderly. They may have confused the specific account or the bank records might be old prints. The intent of the transaction is what matters. The intent matters, Bennett interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. But the mechanics matter more. You cannot wire money from a bank that does not exist. Bennett did not give them time to recover. He moved to the next item. Let us move to the promissory note. Exhibit B, Bennett said, walking back to our table and picking up the document I had analyzed in his office. This is the document where my client allegedly agreed to give you 50% of her future equity in exchange for a $50,000 cash loan. That is correct, Meredith said, regaining some of her composure. She signed it right at our kitchen table. I made her coffee. And the date on this document is June 4th, 2013. Bennett read. Yes. Meredith nodded. It was a Tuesday. I remember because it was raining. Bennett turned to the judge. Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit Defense 1. It is a certified medical record from Mercy General Hospital in Seattle. Sterling stood up again, more urgently this time. Your Honor, this is an ambush. Judge Vance slammed his gavel. Sit down. Mr. Sterling, let him speak. Bennett handed the record to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. On June 4th, 2013, the day Mrs. Joseph claims her daughter was sitting in her kitchen in Arizona drinking coffee and signing away her company. Daniela Joseph was admitted to the emergency room in Seattle at 8 in the morning with acute appendicitis. She underwent emergency surgery at 11 o'clock and remained in the recovery ward under heavy sedation for the next 24 hours. Bennett turned back to Meredith. Unless your daughter has the ability to bilocate Mrs. Joseph, or unless she signed this document while unconscious on an operating table 800 miles away, this meeting never happened. Meredith's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Sterling. Sterling was staring at his papers, his face draining of color. My father, sitting in the gallery, suddenly looked very interested in his shoes. Judge Vance did not look at the lawyers. He was looking at the two documents side by side, the promissory note with my perfect signature, and the hospital discharge papers with the time-stamped nurse's logs. He looked up. His expression had changed. The neutral mask of the judiciary had slipped, replaced by the hard, cold glare of a man who realizes he is being played. Mr. Sterling, the judge said. His voice was very quiet. Yes, Your Honor, Sterling squeaked. Judge Vance held up the promissory note. You submitted this to my court as a true and original document. You vouched for its authenticity. I relied on my clients. Your Honor, Sterling stammered. They provided the files. I assumed. You assumed, the judge repeated. He looked at Meredith. Mrs. Joseph, you are under oath. Do you want to explain to me how your daughter signed this paper in your kitchen while she was having an organ removed in another state? Meredith looked panicked. She looked at her husband. Gordon Joseph stood up abruptly in the back row. She must have come the week before, Gordon shouted. We got the dates wrong. It was a long time ago. Sit down, sir, the bailiff barked. Judge Vance pointed a finger at Gordon. Another outburst like that, Mr. Joseph, and I will have you removed in handcuffs. The judge turned back to the papers. He began to flip through the binder with a new energy. He was no longer reading for content. He was hunting for errors. He pulled out the tax return, the one he had paused on earlier. He pulled out the email chain with the Oxford comma discrepancy. He looked at the bank statement with the fake routing number again. This is not a clerical error, Judge Vance said, more to himself than to the room. He looked at me. For the first time, I saw something akin to apology in his eyes. Then he looked at Sterling. We are going to take a recess, the judge announced, and during this recess, I want the court clerk to run a verification on every single financial institution listed in the plaintiff's evidence binder. He leaned forward. And Mr. Sterling, if I find one more routing number that leads to nowhere, or one more date that defies the laws of physics, I am going to refer this entire matter to the district attorney's office before lunch. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. All rise. As the judge swept out of the room, the atmosphere fractured. The reporters were no longer writing. They were typing frantically into their phones. The story had shifted. The ungrateful daughter narrative was dead. The con artist family headline was being written in real time. Bennett sat down next to me. He did not smile. He simply closed his file. That went well? He said quietly. I looked across the aisle. My mother was still in the witness box, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. Sterling was arguing with my father in hushed, furious whispers. They did not look at me. They couldn't. The mirror had been held up, and for the first time, they were seeing their own reflection instead of mine. The air in the room felt lighter. The crushing weight of their lies was lifting, dissolved by the simple, undeniable solvent of facts. But I knew it wasn't over. A cornered animal is dangerous, but a cornered narcissist is lethal. They had been humiliated. They would not go quietly. I checked my watch. It was 11 o'clock. By noon, everything would change. The court reconvened at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The atmosphere had shifted from the theatrical tension of a family drama to the cold, antiseptic precision of a surgical theater. The emotional appeals of my mother and the blustering indignation of my father had evaporated, replaced by the humming of servers and the glow of projector screens. Bennett stood at the defense table. He looked energized, a shark who had smelled blood in the water. Your Honor, the defense calls Dr. Eris Thorne to the stand. Dr. Thorne was a man who looked like he spent more time with machines than with people. He wore a suit that was slightly too large for him and glasses that reflected the courtroom lights. He was a forensic digital analyst, a man whose hourly rate was higher than the annual salary of the bailiff standing guard at the door. I had hired him 2 years ago to audit my company's internal security, and he was the best in the business. After the swearing-in ceremony, Bennett wasted no time. Dr. Thorne, have you had the opportunity to examine Exhibit C, the email chain provided by the plaintiffs, in which Ms. Joseph allegedly confesses to her debts? I have, Thorne said. His voice was monotone, stripping the statement of any drama, which only made it more devastating. And what were your findings regarding the origin of this email? Bennett asked. Thorne adjusted his glasses and looked at the judge. The plaintiffs provided what is known as a raw header file, claiming it proved the email originated from Ms. Joseph's personal laptop on February 14, 2015. On the surface, the IP address matches a residential provider in the area where the defendant lived at the time. Sterling, the family lawyer, nodded smugly from his table. He clearly thought this was going to be a confirmation. However, Thorne continued, ignoring him. When you strip away the spoofed header information and look at the packet routing data, specifically the time-to-live values and the TCP sequence numbers, a different picture emerges. This email did not originate from a residential device. It originated from a virtual private server hosted in a data center in Eastern Europe, which was then routed through 3 different proxy servers before being stamped with a fake local IP address. Judge Vance leaned forward. In English. Thorne? It means the email is a forgery. Your Honor. Thorne said simply, it was sent by a machine designed to look like a person, and not just any machine, a sophisticated piece of software used for identity masking. Bennett walked to the projector screen. He pulled up a graph that looked like a jagged heartbeat line. Dr. Thorne, can you explain what this graph represents? This is a keystroke dynamic analysis, Thorne explained. When a human being types, they have a unique rhythm. The time between pressing the A key and the S key is distinct to their muscle memory. It is as unique as a fingerprint. We call it flight time. He pointed a laser pointer at the screen. The plaintiffs provided a digital copy of the email drafting process, likely unaware that the file metadata contained the keystroke logs. This graph shows the typing speed of the person, or thing, that wrote the confession email. The room was silent. Notice the consistency, Thorne said. The flight time between every single character is exactly 120 milliseconds, with a randomized variance of exactly 3 milliseconds added to simulate human imperfection. No human is this consistent, not even a concert pianist. This email was not typed by a hand. It was generated by a script. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was one thing to know my parents were lying. It was another to realize the level of sophistication involved. My father typed with 2 fingers, hunting and pecking for every letter. My mother treated a keyboard like it might explode if she touched it too hard. Neither of them knew what a proxy server was, let alone how to script a keystroke algorithm. Bennett turned to the plaintiff's table. So, Dr. Thorne, if Ms. Joseph did not write this email, and if it was generated by a script, how did the script know what to say? How did it know to mimic her tone? That is the most disturbing part, Thorne said. He clicked a remote, and a new slide appeared. It showed a word cloud, a collection of phrases and stylistic choices. We ran a linguistic analysis on the forged email and compared it to a database of Ms. Joseph's verified writings from college essays, public blog posts from 2010, and old forum comments. The forger's script was trained on her old data. It uses phrases she frequently used 10 years ago but has since abandoned. For example, the use of the word whilst instead of while, and a specific error in comma splicing that she corrected in her professional writing 5 years ago. Thorne looked directly at me, and for a moment, the monotone mask slipped. Someone has been scraping Ms. Joseph's digital footprint for a very long time. He said, they built a profile of her syntax to create this forgery. This was not a spur-of-the-moment lie told by an angry parent. This is a targeted, engineered character creation. Bennett let that sink in. Dr. Thorne, is it possible for an average layperson, say, a retired couple living in the suburbs, to create this kind of forgery? Absolutely not, Thorne said. This requires access to enterprise-level reputation management software and a significant database of the target's history. This is professional work. Bennett turned to Sterling. The lawyer was no longer smug. He was pale, and he was furiously whispering to his assistant. My parents looked confused. They were hearing words they did not understand. Proxy, packet routing, linguistic scraping. They knew they had paid someone to get the evidence, but they clearly had no idea how the sausage was made. I looked at my father. He looked small. He looked like a man who had bought a weapon he didn't know how to fire and had just shot himself in the foot. Bennett turned back to the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice hard, we are no longer dealing with a family dispute. We are dealing with corporate espionage, identity theft, and federal wire fraud. My client is being targeted by a sophisticated third party that is using her parents as a front to gain access to her company's assets. Sterling stood up, his hands shaking slightly. Your Honor, this is speculation. My clients? Your clients are currently in possession of fraudulent digital documents that violate federal law. Judge Vance snapped. He looked furious. The vein in his temple was throbbing. Mr. Sterling, the judge continued, did you vet the source of this digital evidence? It was provided to us. Sterling stammered. By a consultant. Name the consultant, the judge ordered. Sterling hesitated. He looked at my parents. My mother shook her head frantically, her eyes wide with fear. I cannot. I believe that is privileged work product, Your Honor. It is not privileged if it is the instrument of a crime, Judge Vance roared. The sound echoed off the high ceiling. Bennett stepped in. Your Honor, if I may, Dr. Thorne traced the server origin. Thorne nodded. We traced the final hop of the data packet. It belongs to a private server registered to a shell company in Delaware called Apex Solutions. The color drained from Sterling's face completely. Even I recognized the name. Apex Solutions was a Black Ops corporate intelligence firm. They were the people you hired when you wanted to destroy a competitor's reputation, steal their IP, or bury them in legal fees. They were expensive, dangerous, and utterly ruthless. And my parents could not afford them. A realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. My parents were not the masterminds. They were the puppets. Someone else, a competitor, a rival, someone who wanted my technology, had found my weak point. They had found the resentment festering in my family and had poured gasoline on it. They had approached my parents, offered them money or legal help, and handed them this evidence to destroy me. My parents were willing to sell me out, but they weren't the ones buying. Judge Vance looked at the screen, then at the terrified couple in the back row. This court is pausing all civil proceedings immediately, Vance stated. He turned to the bailiff. Lock the doors. Nobody leaves. He looked at Sterling. Mr. Sterling, you are going to provide the full contact information for this consultant to the marshal immediately. And Mr. Joseph? My parents looked up, trembling. You are going to sit right there, the judge said, his voice dangerously low, because before this day is over, we are going to find out who exactly handed you these documents, and God help you if you lie to me one more time. The judge turned to me. Ms. Joseph, he said, it appears you were right. Someone did lie. But it seems the lie is much bigger than this courtroom. I nodded slowly. I looked at my parents. For the first time, I didn't see hate in their eyes. I saw terror. They had signed a deal with the devil to get back at me. And now the devil was coming to collect his due, and he was bringing the federal government with him. Bennett leaned over to me. Apex Solutions, he whispered. That is serious. Daniela, who are you fighting? Everyone, I said, looking at the exit sign. I am fighting everyone. But as I sat there, watching the legal system turn its massive gears toward the truth, I felt a strange sense of calm. The invisible enemy had finally stepped into the light. For years, I had felt the pressure, the bad luck, the stolen contracts. I thought it was just the cost of doing business. Now I knew it was a campaign. And my parents? They were just the Trojan horse. The judge picked up his phone, bypassing the clerk entirely. Get the U.S. attorney on the line, he said into the receiver. Tell him I have a wire fraud case that just exploded in my courtroom, and he is going to want to see this. The trial was over. The war had just begun. The lockdown of the courtroom transformed the space from a hall of justice into a pressure cooker. The air conditioning hummed with a low, menacing drone, masking the whispered, frantic arguments between my parents and their lawyer. Sterling, the United States Marshal, stood by the door, his arms crossed, a silent sentinel, ensuring that the truth could no longer escape the room. Bennett returned to our table with a heavy folder in his hands. He had spent the last hour huddled with the court-appointed forensic accountant who had been summoned by Judge Vance during the recess. Bennett's face was grim. He did not look like a lawyer who was winning. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a car crash and was trying to process the carnage. He slid the folder toward me. "You need to see this. Daniela," he said softly. "We found the motive." I opened the folder. The narrative my parents had spun, that they were the benevolent, wealthy benefactors and I was the leech, evaporated instantly. The numbers on the page were an autopsy of a financial suicide. Gordon and Meredith Joseph were not just broke, they were drowning. The dossier revealed a landscape of ruin, 3 mortgages on the family home, the last one taken out at a predatory interest rate of 14%, credit card debt spread across 12 different cards, totaling over $180,000, a depleted retirement fund that had been cashed out 3 years ago to cover bad investments, which the footnote suggested were actually debts from an online gambling addiction my father had managed to hide from the country club, but not from the IRS. They had 0 liquidity. They had been insolvent for 2 years. I turned the page. And then I saw it. A contract. Not a forgery this time, but a real, legally binding consulting agreement between my father and a subsidiary of Apex Solutions. It was dated 6 months ago. The terms were simple and horrifying. Apex Solutions agreed to cover the legal fees for the lawsuit against me, specifically retaining the high-priced firm of Sterling & Associates, in exchange, upon a successful judgment or settlement. My parents agreed to transfer 40% of the recovered assets, meaning my company's intellectual property, to Apex. But there was a signing bonus. My stomach churned as I read the line. Apex had paid my parents $50,000 cash up front just to initiate the lawsuit. $50,000. That was the price of their daughter. I looked up from the papers and stared at them across the aisle. My father was slumped in his chair, rubbing his face with shaking hands. My mother was staring at the wall, her eyes glazed over. They weren't grieving parents. They were mercenaries who had taken a job to assassinate my character because they needed to pay off the bookies and the banks. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, rearranging every memory I held of them. This wasn't about control. This wasn't about their disappointment in my life choices or their conservative values. It was, and had always been, about economics. I thought back to my childhood. I remembered the way my father used to check my piggy bank, not to teach me savings, but to see what was there. I remembered how my mother pushed me into child modeling for a brief, miserable summer when I was 6, getting angry when I didn't book jobs. I remembered the way they looked at me when I got that scholarship, not with pride, but with relief that they wouldn't have to spend their own money. They had never seen me as a person. To them, I was an asset class. I was a venture capital investment that was supposed to yield a return. When I left home and cut them off, I became a distressed asset, a non-performing loan. And when they ran out of money, when the house of cards they built on debt and appearances started to collapse, they didn't look for jobs. They didn't downsize. They looked at their portfolio and realized the only thing of value they had left was their connection to me. But they couldn't ask me for money because I had built walls. So they decided to raid me. They partnered with corporate sharks who wanted my technology. Apex Solutions knew they couldn't buy my company because I would never sell. They couldn't steal the tech because my encryption was too good. So they found the back door. They found the greedy, desperate people who shared my DNA. Apex provided the fake documents. Apex provided the sophisticated email forgeries. Apex provided the script. All my parents had to do was stand in court, cry on cue, and sign the papers. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that was absolute. It was the death of hope. Somewhere, deep down, a tiny part of me had still wanted to believe that they were just misguided, that their cruelty came from a twisted form of love. But this was not love. This was harvesting. Bennett watched me read the contract. He saw the color leave my face. "Daniela," he said quietly, "this changes the strategy. We can end this right now. We show this to the judge. We show this to the U.S. attorney. They go to prison." I looked at the contract again. I looked at the $50,000 figure. They sold me for the price of a mid-range sedan. I said, my voice sounded strange to my own ears. detached and clinical. Bennett nodded. They are desperate. People do terrible things when they are cornered. I closed the folder. I do not want a settlement. I said. Bennett frowned. What do you mean? If we reveal this now, the judge declares a mistrial. They get arrested. It goes to a criminal court. It drags on for months. They will plead insanity or coercion. They will play the victim again. I looked at Sterling, who was sweating through his expensive suit. He knew about the contract. He had to. He was paid by Apex. I want them to admit it. I said, I want them to say it. Daniela, Bennett warned, you don't need a confession. You have the paper trail. I stood up. The marshal looked at me, his hand resting near his belt. The room was still locked, a sealed aquarium of guilt. I walked toward the aisle. Bennett tried to grab my arm, but I shook him off. Your Honor, I said. My voice rang out in the silence. Judge Vance looked up from the bench. He had been reviewing the same financial documents I had just seen. His face was a mask of thunder. Ms. Joseph, you should sit down, the judge said. We are waiting for the federal prosecutor. I have a question for the plaintiffs, I said, standing in the center of the room. Mr. Sterling stood up. Objection. The witness is not on the stand. Overruled, Vance said instantly. He looked at me with intense curiosity. Go on. Ms. Joseph. I turned to my parents. They looked up at me. My mother's mascara had run, creating black streaks down her face. My father looked like he was aging 10 years with every passing minute. You didn't write those emails, I said. It wasn't a question. My father looked away. You didn't forge the bank statements, I continued. You don't know how. I took a step closer. Who told you that you could beat me? My mother let out a sob. It was a raw, ugly sound. They said it would be easy, she whispered. Sterling grabbed her arm. Shut up, Meredith. Judge Vance pointed his gavel at Sterling. One more word, counselor, and you will be in a cell before dinner. I ignored the lawyer. I looked only at the woman who had given birth to me. Who said it would be easy? I asked. The man in the suit, she said, her voice shaking. He came to the house. He said you had too much. He said you didn't deserve it. He said you left us to rot. So you sold me? I asked. We needed the money, my father burst out. He stood up, his face red and twisted. We were going to lose the house. Daniela, the bank was calling every day. You were sitting in your high tower with your millions, ignoring us. You owe us. There it was, the entitlement, the naked, ugly truth. I didn't owe you a penny, I said calmly, but if you had asked, if you had just told me the truth. I stopped. I realized that was a lie. If they had asked, I might have helped, but I would have done it with conditions, and they hated conditions. They wanted the money without the shame of asking. They wanted to take it by force because that was the only dynamic they understood. Dominance. You signed a contract with Apex Solutions. I said, you agreed to give them my patent rights in exchange for $50,000. My father froze. How do you know that? Because I am not the careless child you remember. I said, I checked the details. I turned to the judge. Your Honor, I said, the defense moves to submit the consulting agreement between Gordon Joseph and Apex Solutions into evidence, and we move to unseal the financial records of the plaintiffs to prove that this entire lawsuit is a malicious prosecution funded by a third-party competitor for the purpose of corporate espionage. Judge Vance looked at Sterling. Is that true, Mr. Sterling? Are your fees being paid by a third party with a vested interest in the defendant's intellectual property? Sterling opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the door, realizing there was no exit. I cannot discuss fee arrangements, Your Honor. That is a yes, Vance said. The judge looked at my parents. You too, he said, his voice filled with disgust. You have wasted the court's time. You have perjured yourselves. You have attempted to weaponize the justice system to rob your own daughter. My mother stood up, reaching out to me. Daniela, please, she wailed. We didn't know it would go this far. They told us you would just settle. They said you wouldn't fight. please, tell him. Tell him we are family. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had mocked my independence, who had tried to break me when I was weak, and who had sold me when I was strong. I felt a ghost of the little girl I used to be, the one who just wanted to be seen. I took that ghost and I buried her deep, once and for all. Family doesn't sue family for $5 million based on lies, I said. I turned my back on them. I am ready for your ruling, Your Honor, I said to the judge. But the judge wasn't done. He was looking at the back of the courtroom. The doors opened. 3 men in dark suits walked in. They were not court security. They were FBI agents. The U.S. attorney had arrived, and he had brought the cavalry. My father slumped back into his chair, covering his face. My mother began to scream, a high, thin sound of absolute panic. I walked back to my table and sat down. Bennett put his hand on my shoulder. "It is over," he said. "No," I said, watching the agents approach my parents. "It is just beginning. They wanted to see what I was made of. Now they know." I watched as the agents handcuffed my father. I watched as they read my mother her rights. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the clean, sharp sensation of a tumor being removed. The toxicity was finally being cut out. My father looked at me one last time as they led him away. His eyes were filled with hate. "You did this!" he shouted. "You did this to us!" I didn't blink. "No, Dad," I said, though he couldn't hear me over the commotion. "You did this. I just turned on the lights, the night before the final gavel was set to fall." The silence in my hotel room was louder than the city traffic 20 floors below. I had not gone home. My security team advised against it, and frankly, I did not want to be in a place that contained my personal sanctuary while my mind was still on the battlefield. I checked into a suite at the Four Seasons, a neutral ground with thick walls and heavy curtains that blocked out the world. I sat by the window, watching the stream of headlights on the highway. My phone sat on the glass table. Face up, I was waiting for the fallout. When you detonate a nuclear device in the middle of a family dynamic, the shockwave takes time to travel, but it always arrives. It arrived at 2 a.m. The screen lit up. The number was blocked, but I knew who it was. My parents were in federal custody, likely being processed or sitting in a holding cell waiting for a bail hearing that might not come. That left only one person. I answered the phone but did not speak. I let the silence stretch, forcing the other person to step into the void. "Daniela?" The voice was whisper-thin, trembling with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. It was Alyssa, my sister, the golden child, the one who had sat silently at the dinner table while my parents tried to extort me, the one who had watched the trial from the gallery, her face a mask of conflict. "Hello?" "Alyssa," I said. I expected anger. I expected her to scream at me for ruining the family, for putting Mom and Dad in a cage. But she didn't scream. She sounded like she was hiding in a closet. "They are saying it is conspiracy," she whispered. "The lawyer called me. He said the FBI is looking at 20 years. Daniela, 20 years. Dad is 62. He will die in there." He should have thought about that before he signed a contract with a corporate espionage firm. I said, my voice was steady, devoid of the sympathy she was fishing for. "He was desperate," Alyssa pleaded. "You don't understand. The debt. It was eating them alive. They were going to lose the house. They were going to lose the club membership. They were terrified of looking like failures." "And so the solution was to make me the failure?" I asked. "To paint me as a fraud so they could keep up appearances?" Alyssa went quiet. I could hear her breathing, jagged and shallow. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said eventually. "They told us it would be a quick settlement. The man from Apex. He said you would pay to make it go away. He said rich people always pay to avoid a scandal. We thought you would just write the check, and we could all go back to normal." "Normal," I repeated. The word tasted like ash. "You mean the version of normal where I am the scapegoat and you are the beneficiaries?" "Daniela, please," she sobbed. "You have to stop this. You can talk to the judge tomorrow. You can tell him it was a misunderstanding. You can refuse to press charges. If you don't testify, the case falls apart. Please, they are your parents. I closed my eyes. It was the same old song, the demand for sacrifice. They wanted me to lay down on the wire so they could walk over me. Just one last time. I cannot do that. Alyssa. Why? She cried. Why are you so cruel? You have everything. You have millions. Why do you need to destroy them too? Because they didn't just want my money. Alyssa, I said, my voice hardening. They wanted my reputation. They wanted to destroy the one thing I built for myself, and they used my own life against me. I paused, gripping the phone tighter. I want to know how they did it. Alyssa, I want to know how they got the data. The expert said the AI was trained on my writing, my private writing. How? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Alyssa? She took a deep breath. The attic, she whispered. What? When you left, when you ran away at 18, you left a box, Alyssa said. It had your old laptop, the one with the stickers on it, and your journals, from when you were 14 to 17. I felt the blood drain from my face. I remembered that box. I had hidden it under the floorboards of my closet. I thought I had taken it, but in the rush of leaving, in the panic of escaping that house, I must have left it behind. Mom found it a week after you left, Alyssa continued. She didn't throw it out. She kept it. She said she wanted to know what you were thinking. She read them. Daniela. She read everything. I felt a wave of nausea. Those journals were my soul. They contained my fears, my dreams, my anger, my most private thoughts about growing up in that suffocating house. And my mother had read them. She had violated my mind long before she tried to violate my bank account. And the laptop? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. They gave it to the man from Apex, Alyssa confessed. He cracked the password. It was your birthday. They downloaded everything, every essay, every email draft, every chat log. That is how they built the profile. That is how they made the emails sound like you. I walked to the window and pressed my forehead against the cold glass. The level of premeditation was sickening. It wasn't just a financial crime. It was an emotional autopsy. They had dissected my youth to build a weapon to kill my adulthood. You knew, I said. You knew they had the box. I saw them take it down, Alyssa admitted. And you said nothing. I was scared. Daniela, you know how Dad gets. You know how Mom is. If I went against them, then you are just as guilty as they are, I said. No, Alyssa shouted. I didn't sign the contract. I didn't take the money. But you are asking me to save them. I said, you are asking me to let them get away with it. I am asking you to have mercy. I do not have mercy, I said coldly. I have justice. And tomorrow morning, I am going to make sure the judge sees the full picture. There was a pause. Then Alyssa's voice changed. It became smaller, terrified. If you do that, if you send them to prison, I will have nothing. They mortgaged my house too. Daniela, I co-signed. If they go down, I lose my home. I lose everything. I realized then why she was calling. It wasn't love for our parents. It wasn't sisterly concern. It was self-preservation. She was the collateral damage, and she knew the blast radius was about to hit her. I am sorry, Alyssa, I said. I truly am. But you chose your side 15 years ago. You stayed in the house. You played the game. Now the game is over. I hung up. I didn't block the number. I didn't need to. I knew she wouldn't call back. I sat in the dark for a long time. The revelation about the journals gnawed at me. My mother had hoarded my private thoughts like ammunition, waiting for the day she could load them into a gun. It proved that the malice wasn't a sudden desperation. It was a chronic condition. My phone buzzed again, a text message. It was from Alyssa. I stared at the preview. It wasn't a plea. It was a file, an audio file. Below it was a single line of text. I recorded this when the Apex man came over. Use it. Just please don't sue me too. I hesitated. Then I pressed play. The audio was grainy, recorded from a pocket or a purse, muffled by fabric. but the voices were clear enough. "Don't worry about the legal fees." Gordon, a smooth, unfamiliar male voice said. "We handle Sterling. We handle the paperwork. You just need to be the grieving father. Can you do that?" "I can do whatever you need," my father's voice replied. It sounded strong, arrogant. "That girl owes me. She thinks she is so smart with her computers. I want to see her face when we take it all away. I want to see her beg." "And the mother?" the man asked. "I have her diaries," my mother's voice chimed in. She sounded eager. "I know exactly what to say to make her look unstable. She wrote about being depressed when she was 16. We can use that. We can say she is mentally incompetent." "Perfect," the man said. "Sign here. 50,000 now. 2 million when we win." The recording ended. I sat there, the silence of the room rushing back in to fill the space where their voices had been. I had suspected it. The experts had proven the technical side of it. But hearing it, hearing the casual cruelty in their voices, the eagerness to destroy me, was the final key turning in the lock. There was no doubt left. There was no lingering guilt. There was no "what if." I forwarded the audio file to Bennett. I added a message. "Add this to the evidence pile for tomorrow morning. No deals." Bennett replied instantly. "Received. This is the nail in the coffin. Get some sleep. Daniela, it ends tomorrow." But I didn't sleep. I showered, scrubbing my skin until it was red, as if I could wash away the DNA I shared with those people. I laid out my clothes for the next day, a navy blue suit, sharp, professional, armor. I stood in front of the mirror. I looked at the woman staring back at me. She wasn't the girl who wrote in those journals anymore. She wasn't the teenager who cried because she wasn't invited to the neighbors' parties. She was a CEO. She was a survivor. And she was about to do the hardest thing a child ever has to do. She was going to orphan herself, legally and permanently. I packed my bag. I put the folder with the original Apex contract in the front pocket. I checked my phone one last time. 0 missed calls. The family had gone silent. They knew what was coming. The predator had become the prey. And the trap they built had snapped shut on their own legs. I watched the sun come up over the city. It was a cold, gray dawn, but the light was clear. I walked out of the hotel room. I took the elevator down. The car was waiting. "To the courthouse," I told the driver. He looked at me in the rearview mirror. "Big day?" "The biggest," I said. I looked out the window as we drove. The streets were waking up. People were walking to work, buying coffee, living their normal lives. They had no idea that in a federal building a few blocks away, a family was about to be legally dismantled. I felt a strange sense of peace. The truth is a heavy burden, but it is lighter than a lie. And today, for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying anything that didn't belong to me. I was ready. The final morning of the trial did not begin with a bang. It began with a silence so profound that I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The gallery, which had been sparsely populated on the first day, was now packed. The presence of the federal agents in the back row had sent a signal that this was no longer a routine civil dispute. It was a crime scene. I sat at the defense table, my hands resting on the polished wood. I felt strangely weightless. For 33 years, I had carried the invisible backpack of my family's expectations and their eventual betrayal. Today, I was going to set it down. My parents sat across the aisle. They were not huddled together as they had been in the beginning. They sat with a foot of space between them, staring straight ahead. They looked like strangers waiting for a bus that would take them to different hells. Sterling, their lawyer, looked like a man who was actively calculating his own malpractice insurance premiums. Judge Vance entered the room. He did not look at the audience. He did not look at the lawyers. He sat down, adjusted his robe, and opened the file in front of him. "Be seated," he said. His voice was devoid of patience. Bennett stood up immediately. He held a small USB drive in his hand. It was the only weapon we had left, and it was the deadliest one. "Your Honor," Bennett said, "before we proceed with closing arguments, the defense moves to submit one final piece of evidence. It was obtained late last night. It is authenticated, and it is relevant to the immediate credibility of the plaintiffs. Sterling stood up, but his protest was weak. Objection. The discovery period is closed. This goes to the heart of the fraud, Bennett countered, and under the federal rules regarding criminal conduct during civil litigation, it is admissible. Judge Vance looked at the drive. Play it. Bennett plugged the drive into the court's audiovisual system. The large screens on the walls turned blue. The speakers crackled. The room went deathly still. Then, the sound of fabric rustling filled the air, followed by a voice that everyone in the room recognized. "I can do whatever you need." It was my father's voice. It was booming, confident, and filled with a casual malice that made the skin on my arms prickle. "That girl owes me. She thinks she is so smart with her computers. I want to see her face when we take it all away. I want to see her beg." A gasp rippled through the gallery. I saw the reporter in the front row stop typing and look up, mouth open. My father did not move. He seemed to turn to stone in his chair. Then came my mother's voice, clear and excited. "I have her diaries. I know exactly what to say to make her look unstable. She wrote about being depressed when she was 16. We can use that. We can say she is mentally incompetent." On the screen, the audio waveform spiked as the stranger's voice, the man from Apex Solutions, cut in. "Perfect. Sign here. 50,000 now. 2 million when we win." Bennett stopped the playback. The silence that followed was not the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of shock. It was the sound of a facade shattering so completely that there was nothing left but dust. Judge Vance looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he slowly turned his head to look at the plaintiff's table. Gordon and Meredith. Joseph sat frozen. My mother was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were white. She was looking around the room, her eyes wide and frantic, realizing that her private cruelty had just been broadcast to the world. My father was staring at the USB drive as if it were a snake that had just bitten him. Judge Vance did not raise his voice. He did not shout. He spoke with a terrifying calm. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, "do your clients deny that those are their voices on the recording?" Sterling stood up. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his clients. He looked at the federal agents standing in the back. He realized that any defense he offered now would make him an accessory to a felony. He sat back down. "No, Your Honor," Sterling whispered. We have no comment." Judge Vance nodded. He closed the binder in front of him. He took off his glasses and placed them on the bench. He folded his hands. "In my 20 years on the bench," the judge began, looking directly at my parents, "I have seen families torn apart by greed. I have seen siblings fight over inheritances. I have seen divorces that turned into wars. But I have never, in all my time, seen parents conspire with a corporate entity to systematically destroy their own child for profit." He paused. "You came into this court crying. You claimed you were victims. You claimed your daughter was a failure who had abandoned you. You swore under oath that you were destitute and that she owed you her livelihood." The judge picked up a piece of paper, the dismissal order he had likely drafted during the break. "But someone," the judge said, his voice dropping an octave, making the room vibrate, "has lied to this court." He looked at me. "Ms. Joseph," he said, "you are not broke, and you are not the one who is morally bankrupt." He turned back to my parents. "The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. That means you can never bring this suit again. But that is the least of your problems." Judge Vance gestured to the back of the room. The U.S. Attorney and the FBI agents stepped forward, their footsteps heavy on the carpet. "I am referring this entire matter, the forged emails, the fake bank statements, the perjury, and the conspiracy with Apex Solutions, to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution." The gavel came down. It sounded like a gunshot ending a long, painful war. "Court is adjourned." The moment the gavel struck, the spell broke. The agents moved in. They did not be gentle. They pulled my father out of his chair. He didn't fight. He looked deflated, a balloon that had lost all its air. The arrogance was gone. The bluster was gone. He was just an old man who had gambled everything on a lie and lost. My mother began to cry, but this time, nobody offered her a tissue. "Daniela!" she screamed as the agent took her arm. "Daniela, tell them we are your parents." I stood up. I smoothed the front of my navy blue suit. I picked up my bag. I looked at them one last time. I saw the fear in their eyes. I saw the realization that the retirement they were heading toward was not going to be on a golf course, but in a federal penitentiary. I felt a ghost of the urge to help them. It was a reflex, trained into me over 3 decades. But then I heard the audio recording in my head again. "I want to see her beg." I turned my back on them. I walked past Bennett. He held out his hand. "Congratulations, Daniela," he said quietly. "You are free." I shook his hand. "Thank you, Bennett." I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The reporters were shouting questions at me. "Ms. Joseph, how do you feel? Ms. Joseph, did you know your sister recorded the tape? Ms. Joseph, what will happen to your company?" I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the double doors at the end of the room. They were tall, heavy doors made of oak and leather. Beyond them lay the lobby, and beyond that, the street, and beyond that, the rest of my life. I pushed the doors open. The air in the hallway was cool and smelled of rain. I took a deep breath. It was the first breath I had taken in 33 years that didn't feel like I was borrowing it from someone else. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I just buttoned my coat, walked out into the gray light of the city, and started walking. I didn't know where I was going, and for the first time, that was perfectly fine. I didn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. The ghosts were gone. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It was a long journey from the courtroom to the truth, and I appreciate you sticking with me until the very end. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening on your commute in London, relaxing at home in New York, or maybe watching from somewhere else entirely? Please leave a comment below and let me know. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more dramas like this, please subscribe to the channel Lila Revenge Stories. Hit that like button and smash the hype button to help this video get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.